panel discussions and clarion call theatre from 18th to 20th December on Facebook and YouTube Live.
Sir, can you hear us? We can't hear you still, sir.
Yeah, can you remove this? Can you remove the...
So can you remove the headphones and try, please? Allow us a moment, sir, then, please. Allow us a moment, please. We cannot hear you at all, sir.
Can you try through the...
So can you try without the headphones, please, once?
Still?
Can you please speak, sir? Just say something. So can you please test your mic, sir? Your mic is muted.
Yeah.
Yes, we can hear you. We can hear you, sir. We can hear you, sir. Just allow us a moment, please.
If you can hear me, then we are halfway there. Now it's a shock you need to fix.
Yes, sir. Absolutely, sir. Thank you so much for staying on with us. I will just have the other panelist here with us.
Okay, thank you. The sound won't
Thank
be
you
as
so
good
much.
as with the headphones, but I hope it's okay. Thanks.
No, sir. We can hear you loud and clear. So that's all right. Thank you
Good.
so much for bearing with us. Thank you.
Sure.
Stay tuned for panel discussions and clarion call theatre from 18th to 20th December on Facebook and YouTube Live.
Hello, General Saab. Can you hear me? I'm not able to hear the General. I still can't hear you. Can you hear me? I think there's a real problem with this software because nothing seems to work.
Sir, we are resolving the issue. Sir, please allow us a moment. I think the same issue that you were facing, Mr. Mehta is also facing.
But you heard me, right? You can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you still, sir. We can hear you still.
Okay, I can't hear him, which is a problem for a dialogue.
Yes, I understand that. Sir, we are working on this. Please just
I'll
bear
wait to
with
hear
us.
from him.
Thank you so much.
कंप्यूटर में हमारे कंप्यूटर में उनके सिस्टम में कुछ गड़बड़ है सुनाई नहीं दे रहा
His Excellency the Governor, Mr. VPS Badnor, he asked me, he said, General, is there a military literature festival anywhere in India or in the world? So I told him, I said, I'm not aware there isn't any military literature festival anywhere. So he said, why can't we have it in Chandigarh? I said, certainly we can make an effort, but first I must have the views of the Chief Minister of Punjab. And over the years, Punjab has been on the route of invasions by many people. And that was followed by a number of invasions. And it turned the people into a hardy, tough, enduring stock, and the kind of people who would leave their plowshares and pick up their swords and fight. The soul of the Military Literature Festival actually focuses around the warrior, his activities, his culture, his knowledge, and his understanding that since he is powerful, he must always help the weak. Well, I'm sure that this year we'll have a great virtual content which is going to reach out to the far corners of the globe. I encourage all viewers to switch on the 18th of this month at 10:30, because the Raksha Mantri will be addressing the Military Literature Festival in company of His Excellency the Governor and the Honorable Chief Minister.
Mr. Mehta, can you hear me? So can you speak something right now? No, we can't hear you, sir.
इनको ब्रॉडकास्ट करा दिया है?
Hi, sir.
I think we'll be going ahead with somebody else, so let me hang up on you.
Good evening, Shashi sir. It's
Good evening, Maj Bikramjeet. Are you taking over from General Malik?
no, sir. Well, yes, I shall have to step in for him for the time being, because I think we are unable to get his audio. However, sir, it's a great honor just to sit opposite you, even though it's virtual, and I would have just found it on my dreams to be here. But I've heard a lot of your talks, and I love the way you go bashing up the British about what they did to us, sir. And yeah, I'm an ardent admirer of yours.
Thank you.
But I would like to ask you a question on here, sir. I mean, I understand what the British have done to us, and what probably the Mughals have done, and they've come and looted us and gone. I'm talking about what they left behind for us and what we have achieved after that. So would you shed some light on that, sir?
Right. Well, I mean, ostensibly here to talk about my new book, The Battle of Colombia. I'd be happy to talk about that in addition, but since you asked the question, in order to keep the audience engaged while we are connecting. Hello. I think it's going to talk if there's another conversation going on at the same time. Hello. Right. So just to say that on the question you asked about the British, you know, the conventional argument the British make and their apologists make is that they left behind a number of institutions, practices, and so on, which India has benefited from. The problem is that none of those things had anything to do with the interests of India. Every single thing that the British case can today point to, without exception, was only created for the British in their interest in order to prolong their role or enhance their profits. The classic example often cited is the railways. Well, yes, we have railways, but you don't actually have to go to the trouble and expense of being colonized in order to have railways. The Thais, the Japanese, and others built railways without actually having to suffer the indignity of colonial oppression. The British made it very clear, going back to the first note on the subject by the then Governor General Lord Dalhousie, went directly into the heart of the matter by saying the railways would serve the purpose of actually enabling British soldiers to go into the interior to quell any restive natives, and at the same time to extract resources from farther into the countryside and bring it to the ports from where they could be shipped to England. So the railways were conceived very much as an instrument of colonial exploitation. They were also built through a magnificent colonial scam where the Indian taxpayer paid for the construction and the British reaped all the profits. In fact, those who invested in the London Stock Exchange in Indian railway stock received double the rate of reward of the highest earning government securities available at that time. And what is more, as a result, no expense was spared because all the money was going to England anyway. So each mile of Indian railway costs 9 times as much as each mile in countries like the United Kingdom, I beg your pardon, like the United States or Canada, where railways were being built at the same time. On top of that, the railways were run as a racist enterprise. Every significant position, from station master to ticket collector, all the way up to the grandees of the railway board, had to be white Europeans. Other than perhaps the smallest substations, Indians were given no significant positions. When Indians attempted to master certain skills, such as engine driving, they were promptly drummed out of the service in whites hide. It was only at the end of the First World War, when so many young whites were killed, that they had a shortage of available white people to recruit, that they significantly turned initially to Anglo-Indians and then to other Indians. So this is not exactly something the British can point to with any pride. Even the costing of the enterprise, it was essentially there to transport the Lad Sahibs in first-class compartments and a lot of freight at the lowest freight rates in the world at that time. Whereas when third-class compartments with wooden slat benches were added to bring on the Indian passengers who wanted to use the trains, the fact is that they paid the highest passenger rates of any railway in the world. So in every respect, the railways were a colonial enterprise. It was only at the end of the British Empire that India was able to convert the purposes and the use of the railways to India's purposes. And indeed, we went the other way now, where our freight rates became the most expensive in the world and our passenger rates the cheapest in the world, because our railways became about serving the Indian public and the Indian traveling public in particular. And that may not be a good thing at the end, because the freight rates have to come down, or we'll be continuing to send all our goods on the congested highways and pollute our air through diesel fumes from our trucks. But the idea still is that at least India is making its own decisions for its own people, whereas the railways were constructed entirely for the British. I have told in my book, An Era of Darkness, I've told similar stories about every one of the other alleged contributions of the British to India.
So I have a point here. So when somebody comes to conquer us, I'm sure they do not come to conquer us and pamper us over things. I mean, if they have come to conquer and we have allowed them to conquer us, then they would take advantage of whatever they can about, maybe our weaknesses or whatever it is. My point is, nobody comes to conquer or rob you. And I mean, if a thief enters your house, he's not going to come there and say, "Oh, what can I get you breakfast in bed?" He's of course going to rob you and kind of shoot you. So my point is, what they did in those times, that's what conquering was all about. So they were right in their own way. My point is, what after they left? Where does the nation stand today? And we always hide behind this garb of, abhi 50 saal to hue hain independence ko, abhi 70 saal to hue hain independence, and we've been hiding behind that for a long time. Why is that with us?
Okay, so two different answers. And the first half, you're absolutely right. That's what conquerors did. And indeed, for the first century or so of British rule, right up to the so-called mutiny of 1857, the British didn't really pretend otherwise. They were basically there to loot and drain as much as they could, though, of course, they did also conduct some certain reforms and so on, but very minimal, because they thought that they would be left more in peace if they actually didn't tamper with Indian society, do anything for India. The irony, however, was from the second half onwards, particularly after the ruthless suppression of the Indian revolt in 1857-58, the British then started issuing, as it were, a different version of their rule, claiming they were in India on a civilizing mission, laughable considering India was a far older and more accomplished civilization when they came than what they had become by 1857. And on top of that, they actually managed to persuade their own people and the rest of the world that theirs was an exercise in benign altruism. In fact, in the first decade of the 21st century, there were writers like Neil Ferguson, Lawrence James, Andrew Roberts, and so on, who published books claiming that everything India is achieving today in globalization and so on is because of the foundations laid by the British and how wonderful British colonialism was and how India should be grateful. No victim is grateful to their kidnapper, their oppressor, their looter, their thief. And my book was very much a response to this kind of revisionism going on that echoed the fraudulent press releases of the late Victorian era rather than the actual truth of British imperial exploitation. So on the first part of what you said, you are right, they behaved as conquerors would do. And my answer is yes, they did. And it was high time they admitted it, rather than pretending to the world that they were there as some sort of act of charity. There were no Mother Teresas in the British ranks. So that's the first and most important answer to your question. On your second question, I actually agree with you. I don't think that colonialism can be an excuse for our failures of today. And I have myself said that when I published the book, that my book is not an attempt to either excuse, justify, or in any other way help us evade responsibility for our own failures of governance. The past is in the past, but I feel that every society has an obligation to know about its past, just as every one of us wants to know about our parents, our grandparents, our families, our background. Similarly, or you in your military career, every one of your soldiers and officers I've met is so proud of the history of your regiment. That's normal. Similarly, we as a society, as a nation, we have an obligation, it seems to me, to know about our past, because if you don't know where you're coming from, how will you appreciate where you're going? And that's why, to me, it's extremely important that we have that sense of history. But it's not in any way to excuse our failures. Today, if any Indian leader of any party were to start blaming the British for what's going wrong today, I'd tell them, wake up and take responsibility, because we are now where we are. You've found the situation you've got, make it work. There's this wonderful old joke about the lost driver in the countryside somewhere who asks a nearby peasant, how do I get to Delhi from here? And the peasant replies, well, if I were going to Delhi, I wouldn't start from here. And that's the kind of blunt answer. You simply can't afford to say it. You need to get to Delhi. Today's leaders need to get to a better future for all Indians. No point saying we wouldn't start from here, colonialism put us in a bad shape. We have to live with what we've got and make a success of it. So there I'm agreeing with you. On the first half, I don't.
So I also have a point. You are the Lord and Master of English, as we all call you. The Lord and Master of English.
I never say that, and the British wouldn't say that.
We call you that, sir. So I need to know more about this book on thesaurus, kind of the one which you've just written. We'll come back to that in the second half. My first question to you on the issues are, is it of any advantage that we today in our country speak English? How does it turn into an advantage, or was it, had they not come and we had not learned English, would we still be at the advantageous step across the world? I mean,
no, look, I think it is an advantage to have English. Let's not pretend otherwise, because undoubtedly, through accidents of history, and not only because of British rule, also because of the US dominance of the world economy since the 1950s, English is undoubtedly the single most useful language across the planet today. And I say single most useful, not the most widely spoken, because in terms of numbers, the Chinese are still ahead. But Chinese is only really useful to communicate with people from China. Yeah.
So just one second. There was a friend of mine who just talked to me about this, and he said something like, all the countries that do not speak English have been somewhere down the line superpowers. So whether you take China, you take Russia, or you take Japanese, who do not actually promote English as such, and they're very proud of their own language, they being ahead. I mean, that's just one of the arguments which I would like you to, expand on and
No,
let me know.
the fact is, you asked about whether it's useful, and the truth is, it is useful to have English simply because in a globalized economy, you want to be able to communicate with clients, customers, etc., around the world, and English is everybody's second or third or fourth language. So if all else fails, if you're selling something in Germany, the German guy won't be able to speak Hindi or Chinese for that matter, but he will understand English as a second language, and therefore for you to have it is an asset. And the same with the Chinese, for example, are now teaching English in some fancy schools from the kindergarten onwards. But in most government schools, from the second grade onwards, you learn Chinese, you learn English in China. As a Chinese person growing up in China, in a Chinese communist system, proud of your Chinese, but you learn English as a second language. So the usefulness of English is not to be debated. Whether it's German, whether it's Russian, whether it's Chinese, everyone knows that the language, the first foreign language you need to have some acquaintance of, because it is so influential and useful around the world, is English. Not as a language you need to be perfect in, but as your second or third or fourth language. And frankly, many Indians are instinctively bilingual or even trilingual. It's in our society, you grow up often speaking one language at home, studying another language at school, perhaps having a third language at work, and then learning a fourth language if you were so inclined by going to a class. And all of these things would mean that you have an opportunity to slot in English in one of those slots. I'm not saying that if you are proud of your Hindi or your Bangla or your Assamese, that you need to suddenly, or your Tamil for that matter, that you need to suddenly reject English. I'm saying by all means, flourish in Tamil, read in Tamil, write literature in Tamil, but know enough English that you can function when you meet somebody who doesn't know Tamil, because the vast majority of the world doesn't. That's the same story for all the other languages.
So where does Hindi stand when we come to, when you talk about regional languages and you say, well, your second language, you better learn to speak in English because that's an international language. But what about Hindi per se for our regional, state-wise?
Hindi is the most useful Indian language so far for northern India. In other words, you can be understood in Hindi almost anywhere north of the Vindhyas. But it doesn't get you very far south of the Vindhyas or in many places in the east and northeast. And therefore, the challenge that comes up is that when, for example, some of my friends in the ruling party try and talk about making Hindi the national language, the difficulty they run into is the resistance of those who feel themselves in India disadvantaged by any one Indian language taking precedence over theirs. You see, if it's English, everyone is at an equal disadvantage or advantage. If you are educated in English or have taken the trouble to learn some English, whichever part of the country you're in, you can deal with people from any other part of the country. Whereas if Hindi becomes a national language, which it's not, it's only an official language. It becomes a national language and is used for all government business, for the courts, for the media, for parliament, and so on. What happens? It means that Shukla and Singh and Sharma are functioning in a language they've heard from their mothers' laps, whereas Subramaniam and Reddy and Nair are suddenly having to learn a different language where they will always be less well equipped than Shukla and Sharma and Singh. And there's going to be an inevitable resentment at the perception that language has reduced them to second-class citizens. So for that reason, Hindi is certainly doing well. It's growing in popularity. In my own lifetime, I've seen how much more Hindi is understood, for example, in the state of Kerala, thanks in part to Bollywood success and in part thanks to the prevalence of Bihari migrant labor coming to look for jobs in Kerala. And these young Bihari boys, their Malayalam is not often what it should be. So very often the Malayalis learn enough Hindi to communicate with them, and so on and so forth. So the normal processes of national evolution, the popularity of cinema, the increasing migration within the country will spread languages. And maybe Hindi will win eventually the hearts and tongues of a majority of the Indian population. But it's not now, and it should never be imposed or thrust upon the unwilling, because that would divide a country that desperately needs to remain united.
But so when I was a child and I was studying in Chandigarh, and then my father was in the army too, and we got posted wherever. The regional language was one of the languages that you had to learn as a part of your curriculum. You had to learn Punjabi, and you had to learn Gurumukhi. And when I went to Rajasthan, you had to learn. And when I went to Gujarat, we had to learn Gujarati. So why not? Why don't these states have the similar thing for Hindi, that come no matter what, to certain standards, you will have to learn Hindi also?
Well, actually, the thing is that most of us realize we can't function meaningfully in northern India without Hindi. And therefore, a vast majority of Indian school children will learn Hindi as at least a second language. Certainly, anyone who's gone to school in an Indian metropolis would probably be literate in Hindi, be able to read, write, and spell, because they've learned it in school as a second language, even if they're in an English medium school. The challenge is going to be that you cannot deny people the right to refuse to do that. So Tamil Nadu, for example, even though right now it is a ruling party that is closely allied with the BJP that's ruling in Delhi, and which is associated with the Hindi, Hindu, Hindutva slogan that has sustained that movement for some time. Even despite all that, when the government returned to the idea of the three-language formula and suggested that schools should offer English, Hindi, and the state language, Tamil Nadu immediately said, we prefer the two-language formula. We'll offer English and the state language. We don't want to learn Hindi. And you can't impose Hindi upon Tamil Nadu if they don't want it. And that's essentially it. The point is that you can encourage them. If you go to a private school in Tamil Nadu, you may well choose to learn Hindi. You might be able to learn Hindi there. But you will not go to a government school and have Hindi thrust upon you. That's the situation at the moment in Tamil Nadu. In other states, that's so far not a problem. In neighboring Kerala, the capital of which I represent in Parliament, Hindi is available and Hindi is taught. I can't say that the quality of what the kids learn is outstanding. That's another matter. But at least it is taught. And I think that option should always exist. Look, I went through the sort of senior Cambridge examination system and did reasonably well in elementary Hindi. But it was only after living in Delhi to go to college and picking up the Delhi of the streets, talking to panwalas and rickshawalas and taxi drivers, that my Hindi became anything like remotely fluent. Classrooms actually don't teach languages very well. Today, of course, you can go to a lab and hear the language spoken on headphones and so on. But in India, since all those things are not widely available, it's not in the classroom that you're going to promote Hindi. You can learn it, and it can be an asset. Certainly, you can be literate in it. But at the end of the day, you have to live the language. And people who feel they do not need to speak Hindi in their daily life or understand Hindi in their daily lives just to get through the day, such people are not going to want to be able to master Hindi. And I think the sooner the Hindi folks realize that, the better. I know many South Indians who've grown up in North India and speak fluent Hindi, indistinguishable from a North Indian. But a South Indian growing up in South India will not be able to do that. Whereas a North Indian growing up in South India may speak Hindi at home, the South Indian won't. So the important message is understand the complexity and profusion and diversity of our languages in our country. Realize that that diversity is a strength of ours. Don't impose and thrust it on anybody. Let languages evolve and people will use them when they need to use them.
So let's now talk about your Tharoor Saurus, as you call it. The Lord and Master shall speak and we shall listen.
Yeah, Tharoorasaurus is actually a bit of a tongue-in-cheek book. It is, I mean, the text inside is serious and accurate. But as you can see from even the cover of the book, it's right here behind me, the one showing me, my face on top of a dinosaur. It's really a combination of three things. The Tyrannosaurus, since everyone is terrified of big words, and Tyrannosaurus is a terrifying dinosaur. And of course, a dinosaur is an old-fashioned creature to whom words matter. Tharoor, my name, and thesaurus, because of course people like looking up words. And Tharoorasaurus is simply a collection of words with a little bit of a description of what they mean, how they originated, and anecdotes and stories that explain their usage and how they evolved and so on. So it was fun to write. And it was partially because the publishers, Penguin, having noticed the extent to which this outsized reputation for me, the outsized reputation that I have developed as a wordsmith or whatever else, a word maven, they said, let's do this book because people will be interested in the words you know. And it's the kind of book that people can dip into. It's got 53 different words. The idea being 52, one for a week, every week of the year, and the 53rd for a leap year. And it's really quite quirky. There are words which many people had not heard of till they opened my book. There are many words which people have heard a lot of, particularly in the last year, but may not know all the origins and the history of, words like pandemic and quarantine. There are words that some people have heard of and others haven't, but which I think are fun and people should know them, like defenestrate, which is literally to throw out of the window, but is metaphorically used to reject and discard things. And there was an incident in history called the defenestration of Prague, which involved a couple of parliamentarians being tossed out of an open window in Prague Castle. And they survived that defenestration by landing in a festering, moldering heap of garbage. So I tell such stories and make it, but they're also tragedies. How General Akbar Khan, Emperor Akbar killed the general who was his nurse's favorite son by having him defenestrated. And when the first time around he didn't die, he picked him up, had him brought up and thrown out of the window again till he was killed. So defenestration, serious as well as amusing stories are told about it. But also words that express certain ideas. For example, epicaricacy is about taking pleasure in the misfortunes of others. And sadly, too many Indians are prey to that kind of emotion, so they should know the word for it. That's what the Tharoorasaurus is here. I gather from the chat box on our talk that General Malik is now available. And since he's prepared to talk about the Battle of Belonging, which was what this talk was advertised as, shall we do that too, Bikramjeet?
Surely, sir, we shall.
Is he here? Is he connected?
I will just have to check control. Control, can you hear me? Right. Can you patch him through, or will we have to go on a different platform altogether? They'll just come back to us in a minute, sir.
Let's continue talking, Major Bikramjeet. Yes, so among the words in Tharoorasaurus is one which I hope will also become more popular, and that's Agatha Cacological, which has nothing to do with Agatha Christie. But Agatha Cacological refers to a combination of good and evil. And in life, and particularly in your military life, don't you see so much of that around you? When I read about soldiers fraternizing with soldiers on the other side, isn't it a recognition of the Agatha Cacological nature of warfare and conflict? That same guy whom you're having a coffee with at the United Nations cafeteria or exchanging mithai with on Diwali at the border is terribly evil and out to kill you when he's pointing a gun at you in the middle of a war. The mixtures of good and evil that people, situations, and so on have lends itself to a word, and that's why Agatha Cacological.
I just wanted to bring up a little incident about what I heard some time ago, or what I learned some time ago, is a word called teetotaler. And a lot of people mistake that to be a teetotaler, whereas the spelling goes a teetotaler. And where does that come from? And you of course know it, but just for the audience, so the teetotaler word comes from the game of golf in olden days, when it was played as a very leisurely game, and everybody would knock their balls and then drive their balls and walk to the ball to where the ball was, and the waiters would follow with Bloody Marys and beers, and the only person who was not allowed to perforce drink during that game was the guy who totaled your tea, and that's why the word came the teetotaler, which is TEE, I think.
That's right. it is TEE, and in fact, the argument about teetotaling is that actually it was a term that is only about now just about 200 years old, because apparently in 1833, a certain Richard Turner, an Englishman, used the word to advocate for abstinence from all alcohol. And this chap, when he died, Richard Turner, had the words author of the word teetotal carved on his gravestone, which is an amusing footnote to your story. but the interesting thing about whether it comes from golf or not is not a story that I've heard. But I entirely believe you. All I know is the story of Richard Turner, because to die with a word you've authored as your biggest legacy is quite amusing. Alcohol, I'm told, actually comes from Arabic. That it's sort of referring to al, as in Al Jazeera or whatever, and kol, which is what you put on your eyes. So how did alcohol, which is alcohol, become connected to booze, which in any case is haram in most of the Arab world? Don't ask me.
So you've been a very versatile writer, and you're an MP, and there are questions that have just come to me about what is your vision of the ideal India?
So that's really what the Battle of Belonging is all about, and I'm glad you asked that, because essentially the question, and you guys in the military are very strongly into patriotism, and I argue in the Battle of Belonging very much in favor of patriotism. The Battle of Belonging is a deep dive into the concepts of nationalism, patriotism, and so on. The first 100 pages I'm studying the theory, the concept, the evolution of nationalism worldwide. Then I talk about how India's freedom struggle and anti-colonial nationalism converted itself over 3 years of debates in the Constituent Assembly to a civic nationalism. And in that civic nationalism, what happened was that everybody was deemed to be equal. Now, there are broadly two kinds of nationalism in the world, and I do a fairly detailed taxonomy of them all. But one is all those linked to factors of identity that you're born with, that are immutable. Things, for example, like your birth in a particular religion, your color of skin, your ethnicity, your language, your region. All of these things tend to be things you can't help. You were just born into them. But if you construct an identity of nationalism from that, that is what can be called as ethno-religious nationalism. Civic nationalism says it doesn't matter what your race, your color, your religion, your language, any of those are. It's not anchored in identity, but in constitutions and institutions. And the Indian constitution recognizes that kind of civic nationalism, where if you're Indian, it doesn't matter. You can be a good Muslim, a good Bengali, and a good Indian all at once. You can speak Punjabi, you can be a Jat, you can be a male or a female. Your rights are the same, irrespective. That's what the Constitution guarantees you. As for patriotism, patriotism is about loving your country because it's yours, because you belong to it and it belongs to you. The way you'd love your mother, you don't have to claim that she's perfect to love her. You don't need to claim that your country is perfect to be a patriot. Whereas nationalism is often not only a bit aggrandizing, but it's also centered on the state, centered on the flag, centered on the government, and often directed at others who threaten the primacy of the nation. So whereas a patriot is prepared to die for his country, a nationalist is prepared to kill for his state. And there is a difference there, and I think it's important to understand. I think that the civic nationalism of India is one that's worth cherishing and promoting. I don't think nationalism is a dirty word. It led to the long, successful struggle for our independence. But this was a nationalism deeply rooted in India's time-honored civilizational traditions of inclusivity, of social justice, of religious tolerance, the desire to forge a society that allowed individuals to flourish regardless of their background and not allowing those backgrounds to create barriers. Whereas today, I'm afraid many people, especially connected to the ruling establishment, who speak of nationalism mean an exclusionary, aggressive, sectarian, Hindutva form of nationalism that excludes large sections of our society. And that's why I think it's very important that a brand of nationalism anchored in liberal constitutionalism, in democratic rights, safeguarding the rights of every individual, irrespective of their religion, is promoted and protected above all others. And that's the idea of India in our constitution.
Right. So say in case the British had not come, I mean, all the British bashing that you do, say in case they had not come and we hadn't got railways and we hadn't got the other things, do you think that we would be in the state that we are right now? And what would have changed if they had not come?
I actually do believe we would have been, but of course, that's again one of the arguments, going back to our first conversation about the British, was the argument being made that the British are the ones who created the unity of India. I think that's nonsense. All sorts of reasons. Conceptually, it's not true, because the idea of Bharatvarsh goes all the way back to the Rig Veda. The idea that we have a common land framed by the mountains and the sea, and that, as the Harvard scholar Diana Eck put it, has been knit together by the sacred tracts of pilgrimage for thousands of years. That clearly creates a unified civilizational space, the space of India. I've argued that in the book, and I stand by that argument. Secondly, it's also not true in terms of purely religion. Some people say, well, that's a very Hindu idea. How do Muslims conform? Well, Maulana Azad answered that. He said that even in the Hajj in Mecca, when people came from any part of the subcontinent, whether it was Pathans from the northwest or Tamil Muslims from the southeast, when they came to Arabia, they were referred to by the welcoming Arabs as Hindi. Everybody was seen as coming from a common geographical and civilizational space called Hind. So it wasn't just a Hindu idea. Third, politically, every major ruler of India has tried to unite the entire subcontinent. Going back to Chandragupta and Ashoka's rule extended all the way to Vellore in Tamil Nadu. And the fact is that others tried, didn't succeed as much as he did. But then you come up with people like the Mughals, where Akbar conquered all of what is today India, Pakistan, last chunk of Afghanistan, Bangladesh, of course, and again made it to the south. Aurangzeb died as you know, Catholic forces resisting him in the Deccan. So the Mughals also sought very much to unite India as one. And finally, if the British had not prevailed in the 18th century, who would have prevailed? Now, the facile European argument is, well, the British would have had the French, you had the French, you would have had the Dutch, whatever. I disagree. I think that the group that seemed most likely to conquer all of India was actually the Marathas. They had made tremendous progress. They had a terrible setback in the Third Battle of Panipat when Ahmad Shah Abdali defeated them, but Abdali had no intention of staying here to conquer. He came, he defeated them, he looted, and he went back to Afghanistan. So the Marathas would normally, if there were no Brits, they would have picked up the pieces and moved on. In fact, for large chunks of time, the Marathas had the Mughal emperor in Delhi as their prisoner. He was still the monarch, the constitutional monarch, if you like, but they told him what to say and how to rule. They made it as far as Calcutta, where the British stopped them with the so-called Maratha ditch. And they made it all the way south. I mean, why do we have sambar in South India? Because the people of Tanjore, when Sambhaji had become the new ruler there, Sambhaji was missing his dal. So they invented a dal for him and named it for him. And they call it sambar. That's how you have sambar in South India. So the Marathas were in South India too. They were in the north, they were in the east, and of course they're from the west. So you would have, I believe, seen something rather like what happened in Japan under the shogunate. The Marathas initially as a military empire would have spread across and unified India. And then with the normal evolution of all democratic forces everywhere in the world, you would have seen a gradual evolution. In any case, the Marathas would have kept the Mughal emperor as a constitutional monarch, just the way the shoguns kept the Japanese emperor as a figurehead. And eventually, the Marathas would have been forced to liberalize and open up the democratic space. And we would have bought our railways rather than getting the British to oppress us and build them.
Right. So
Shashi, can you hear me now?
yes, sir, we can hear you.
Ashok, good to have you back in the business.
Yeah. Good. Let me.
He's done a terrific job of deputizing for you, even though
I know. Yeah. He let you do the British bashing and the railways and the Japanese, but let's get back to the Battle of Belonging,
exactly.
which is a fascinating book. So those of you who are listening to this or watching and listening to this program, let me start by saying that this is an absolutely fascinating book. And it's fascinating because it concerns, although it doesn't talk very much about the armed forces, but it really hits directly at the Indian armed forces, because when Shashi Tharoor asks the question, who is a perfect Indian, I think that perfect Indian is the Indian soldier. Because he embodies all the values that Shashi Tharoor talks in his book. First and foremost, about secular, about being apolitical, about being professional, and being able to look after the people. It's unity in diversity. It's Jai Jawan, Jai Kisan. And yet, in his book, I don't find Shashi Tharoor make a mention, even in passing, that his best candidate for a good Indian is the Indian soldier. Shashi?
I think that's a fair point, Ashok. I think I'll definitely have to put this into a second edition. Not because I haven't thought it, I've actually written elsewhere. For example, about the wonderful traditions of the army, the way in which, for example, we have tremendous respect for every faith. I've heard stories from your colleagues in the army, and I'm sure you could have told me a few yourself. One famous example was when there was a religious ceremony that needed to be conducted, but the Purohit attached to that particular battalion had to, or regiment, had to be away at home because of a sudden bereavement. And the only other religious person around was the Molvi. And he decided to conduct his Hindu service. I forgot what it was, Diwali or whatever, but he gave apparently a brilliant talk about the meaning of that particular Hindu festival that I heard about from 2 or 3 different officers at different times. The way in which we celebrate the unity of Indians in the army, and that I've heard from many, many soldiers and officers over the years, is something that exemplifies the best values of what India should be all about. So, Ashok, thank you for pointing that out. I could have honestly wanted to incorporate a few such stories, but I think I was so taken up with the theoretical debates and the arguments about the issues of national patriotism that I didn't do enough justice to it. However, there is one story which I have told at length from the army, and that was about an incident when an Indian soldier meets, officer now retired, meets a Pakistani general now retired, who in turn tells the story of how his family had been from India, was in India, but his elder brother had migrated to Pakistan, become a brigadier, and had ordered this guy to go off and kill a soldier in the 65 war, an officer sitting in a tank, and the soldier whom this gentleman telling the story killed happened to be the brother of the Pakistani brigadier. The Indian major who was killed was the brother of the Pakistani brigadier who had given the order to kill him. And this kind of story, and then of course this fellow comes to India and apparently goes and visits the mother of the family. The whole thing is extremely moving and powerfully told. I've told it in some detail in the book. So there are stories involving the army as well. And of course, we all know the story of the famous Sahibzada Yaqub Khan and his brother shooting at each other in 47-48 on the Kashmir lines. So there are stories like this that I think are very much worth it.
Yeah, the other point that somewhere in the book you certainly do mention that in the 71 war, you talk about Jagjit Singh Arora, you're talking about how secular India is, and you talk about this Jagjit Singh Arora being a Sikh, Jacob being a Jew, Sam Manekshaw being a Parsi, and Idris Latif being a Muslim. This combined team which got together in during the 71 war was really instrumental in demonstrating the complete secularity in the armed forces. But moving on, somewhere else in the book you talk about, your basic argument in this book is about 2 sets of values that are emerging in the country for the idea of India. And one set of ideas is very divisive, very narrow-minded, and it's followed by the Hindutva ideologues. versus what you yourself describe yourself as the Indian nationalist, the congenital Indian nationalist. Is that right? And then you go on to talk about the clash between these two values. And as a result of this clash between the liberal and the illiberal, the authoritarian, and the other side, you talk about the damage that has been done through this authoritarian leadership, their bigoted supporters, about the damage to institutions. And you mention only in passing about the damage done to the upper, and I quote, the upper echelons of the military. I think you've been a bit kind to this government, because in my own view, that damage has gone much deeper than the upper echelons, especially following what happened during Uri, Balakot, and there's so many other examples of an attempt to politicize much deeper the Indian military. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, I've always been careful to keep the military out of my political interventions. But, we have a lesson, unfortunately, next door, when a relatively sort of secular-minded Pakistani army was completely Islamicized by General Zia and onwards. And I would hate to have a similar situation happening in India. In India, our battalions have their own traditions, and indeed, there are virtually religious slogans that are the battle cries of some of our regiments. And so what? They're religious slogans, regional slogans, they're proud elements of culture. But at the same time, they see each other as brothers in arms, and they're not divisible in these ways. But if they see the society around them being infected by the communal contagion, if they see a society which is unfortunately more and more conscious of religious differences and divides from their fellow citizens, can they forever remain immune? I don't know. It does worry me. As it is, we are witnessing a surprising paucity of Muslim soldiers and officers, for example, in our army. I would say as late as the 70s, even possibly the 80s, we had a very significant proportion of so-called minorities donning the uniforms of all the three services. And though it's correct that the government does not release figures for people by religion in the armed services, we can just know by seeing the names of the people who rise to the top of each of these services. If you look at the top ranks, you find most religions represented. That is becoming, sadly, more and more, or shall we put it this way, less and less multicultural, multi-religious in recent years. And there is a genuine concern that if the lower ranks also start becoming more communal-minded, that the Indian army will not be the army that you served in, Ashokji. It will become something a bit different. So let's hope that the patriotism of Indians will always be above the pettiness of politicians. I still remember seeing that amazing memorial in the island of Gujarat, where the memorial to the ship that was sunk in the 71 war, when Captain Mullah went down with his ship. And what they've done is they've listed the name of every single sailor, every single serviceman on board that ship at the time it sank, because they sacrificed their lives to the country. And it brings absolutely tears to your eyes as you go down those names, because there is no part of the country and no religion of the country that is not represented amongst the names of those who sacrificed their lives for our nation. That has got to be what Indian nationalism and Indian patriotism is built on. In nationalism, where everyone contributes, sacrifices, and is proud, and in nationalism which does not discriminate amongst any of them, where the officer can be a Muslim and the subaltern a Sikh, where the general can be a Christian, or the admiral or the Air Force chief marshal can be a Christian and enjoys the unquestioning allegiance of his Hindu subordinates, because ultimately what unites them is the ethos and ethic of service to India and its armed forces. That is something I think we all want to see always.
I think you're right. INS Kukuri went down, and my
INS
battalion, the second 5 Gurkhas, has a very deep bonding with INS Kukuri. But you talked about my time. Today, the Indian soldier takes his vow, his oath of allegiance on the Constitution of India. In our time, we took an oath on what Field Marshal Chetwood had said. And I want you, Shashi Tharoor, to listen to this and the veterans who came after my time. And this is still very germane to the country, in the values that you embody in the book. And Field Marshal Chetwood, and that's the oath we would take during the passing out ceremony, had said, the safety, honor, and welfare of your country come first. The safety, honor, and welfare of the men you command come next. Your own safety, your own comfort come last, always and every time. And I wish our politicians, and Shashi, you should, because there is a lot of critique today on, somebody mentioned about the 542 people who represent the unity in diversity in India. But if you look at some of the election commission has come out with these figures about their backgrounds, and I dare say that's not the kind of India that you want represented in the Hall of Fame. Your take on that, Shashi?
Well, I won't knock my own colleagues in Parliament, but I understand where you're coming from. Let me say, I've been to the Indian Military Academy, which of course was set up by Field Marshal Philip Chetwood, and I remember very much this extraordinary motto: the safety, honor, and welfare of your country come first, always, and every time. I like that. First, always, and every time. And the honor, welfare, and comfort of the men you command come next, and your own ease, comfort, and safety come last. I mean, that is something which I think is a very good prescription for leadership in any domain, but it's in the military, in particular, the products of the IMA who really take it to heart and carry it out. And we've heard so many stories from the Kargil War, where more officers perished than enlisted men, than the regular soldiers and Jawans. That was very much an epitome of the officers living up to the spirit of the Chetwood motto. So I think that the motto should continue to be taught. It's a great motto. And though Chetwood was an Angrez, he did set up or help set up the Indian Military Academy. I think this motto goes back to an address he delivered in 1932.
That's right.
So it was while the British were still ruling us. But at the same time, in fact, that address, it seems to me, speaks for many things that will outlast the British. I mean, no better material exists in the world, Chetwood said in his speech. And the truth is that's because our people had actually died under British command, perhaps, but they died in many a battlefield. I
think we have time for one more question. One last question for you, Dr. Tharoor, and this is again something from your book. Politics in India has now boiled down to the mathematics of winning elections. I mean, this government, the ruling party has demonstrated this eloquently, that winning elections is all that matters. But if you're winning elections through divisive means, what it does to the country, to the divisiveness in the country, is going to have an impact on what the Americans call homeland security and we soldiers call internal security. And the fallout of this divisive tactics of majoritarianism versus minorities is going to be very difficult. And I heard somebody else say in one of the sessions that all the mess the politicians create, then they expect the soldiers to sort that out. So what is your take on this? That how the politics that impacts on the soldier?
Well, first of all, let me say that I think the principle is Yes, of course, Major Bikram.
Just one question. I'll add to that same question. So, I mean, we have bilateral ties with our neighbors. We carry out trade and trade with them. Isn't there a time when the government should come to a complete and rock horns and say no more trade till the time you sort your ways out? Because it's very discouraging for an army guy, especially for a guy like who's in uniform, who's sitting at the border trying to fight the very enemy that you want to have trade with.
Okay, now that's a different question, but I'll come to it also. Let me first respond to General Mehta by saying that I do believe that the Army's principal duties on the borders of the country, what you might call the security of the nation, national security, is principally about external security as far as the military is concerned, and internal security ought to be the job of the civilian government, which ought to do whatever it can to keep India safe, including from insidious threats that may be imported from outside, as well as anything happening within the country. Now, sometimes things get so bad that what is called for is beyond the capacity or the resources of the civilian government. Often emergency situations, everything from flood relief to search and rescue efforts in the mountains and so on, will require the military equipment, the military skills, the talent, and the training that the military has and nobody else does in comparable measure. And that's why sometimes it is legitimate to take recourse to the military and for the military to provide what you call aid to the civil. So I don't think there's anything wrong. There can't be a blanket ban against it. But I would agree with you that political failures should not result in the loss of military lives. The military is there to save the country, to protect the country from its enemies, internal or external. It certainly can be used in emergency situations for humanitarian relief, rescue missions, and so on. But for the most part, the domains of the two should be kept firmly apart. And on that, I don't disagree with you. I certainly hope that the politicians can do their job well so as not to needlessly risk the lives of our soldiers and officers. On Major Bikramjeet's question, it's a tough one because ultimately many of our situations on our borders need to be resolved through diplomacy, and trade itself is an aspect of diplomatic relations. So, for example, when we had the tragic loss of 20 Jawans and an officer on the Ladakh heights in June of this year, as you know, the government did not cancel all trade relations with China. When Chinese goods were held up in ports as a result of this, there was an immediate scream of protest from a number of Indian manufacturers and companies because some of the things they needed to complete their manufacturing of goods they needed to export suddenly got held up. So there is an interdependence in today's world economy that makes it difficult to just cut the umbilical cord just like that. Secondly, the government did a calibrated action to send a signal. So, for example, by first shutting down in India 49 apps and later taking that up to 110 apps, it may seem like merely trivial gestures, but the government calibrated that it would send a very powerful signal to the Chinese because it would hurt certain powerful and influential Chinese companies. Whether it's enough or not remains to be seen, but that's the kind of thing. If you just completely turned off the tap, you would not be able to use and send calibrated gestures while you are negotiating a withdrawal of the Chinese from the territory they took in April and May. If we all agree, and certainly my party would insist, that the only acceptable outcome of the negotiation is for the Chinese to go back to where they were before the troubles started that have set our relations back so much, then the government should be given the flexibility to use every tool at its command, including trade and investment. And you're seeing, for example, that perhaps Huawei and ZTE, the big Chinese companies that were expecting to be selected for the 5G telecoms rollout in India, they may find themselves squeezed out because of the lack of progress in the negotiations. So all of this is to say, let's give the government what they need to solve the problem while fully respecting your sentiment and concern. I do believe that in today's very complex and interdependent world, it's not that easy to go directly from $100 billion to zero overnight. So don't expect that, and help the soldiers understand is what my answer would be. I guess
So
we're
final-
well over time, in fact.
Yeah, so finally, in this battle of ideology that you talk about in the book, you're on the losing side at the moment. how do you expect, and we'll close the discussion on this, your party is on the decline, the contestant, the ruling party is moving up, it's what I call the 303 government, and you are a 0.50 government or less. So how is this this is the battle between unequals, and you're going to lose this battle of belonging.
No, the battle of belonging is for all of us. It's to be fought in the heart and soul of every Indian. And it's a battle which, frankly, is about the country we belong to and that belongs to us. And that battle is relevant irrespective of the political fortunes of any party. But I would challenge your assumption because, after all, only 37% of the vote was won by the BJP last year and 31% in the previous election. So though they may have successfully exploited some of the insecurities and fears of many voters in enough constituencies to get to that 303, the truth is that there still is a very significant percentage of the population that did not vote for them or their allies, and 63% is a considerable majority that seems to see India in a very non-Hindutva way, and certainly in a way that's sympathetic to parties like mine that stand up for this, shall we say, inclusive idea of India. So I would urge you to rethink your question, Shokji. I think that the majority of the country does not support the hateful rhetoric and exclusionary nature of the Hindutva idea of India, and that if these ideas can continue to be diligently projected and promoted around the country. My book is going to come out in Hindi shortly. It's already coming out in Malayalam. We're going to try and reach people who won't read me in English to try and get the message across that India has a nationalism, a civic nationalism that it can be proud of and that's absolutely worth protecting. So many thanks to both of you. I've really enjoyed exchanging thoughts with the emergency pinch hitter, Major Bikramjeet, and of course my old friend General Ashok Malik. Thank you.
Shashi, my congratulations. I hope your hopes. I hope your hopes about fighting this battle and eventually winning come out true. My congratulations for the book. I would suggest to our veterans to please buy his book. I'm sure he'll give you a military discount, and do read the book because it makes good reading. Congratulations again. Thank you for watching, and thank you the audience. And back to you, Bikramjeet.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much, sir. It's been an honor having both of you over. And thank you so much for sparing time for the Military Literature Festival. It's been very kind, and we're honored to do that. Thank you so much.
All the best. Thanks.